Ancient Egypt was located in northeastern Africa along the longest river in the world named the Nile River. The early African Naqada Third civilization, which previously occupied the region, came to an end around 3100 BC and developed into the foundations of what would become the world-famous empire of ancient Egypt. Early Egypt had been divided into two regions, namely Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt was located just north of Nubia next to the Nile River and had as its capital the city of Mekhen. Lower Egypt was located in the northern part of Africa next to the Nile River and had as its capital the city of Memphis. Generally speaking, Upper Egypt was more urbanized with cities such as Thinis and Naqada already established, while Lower Egypt was more rural with a keen focus on agriculture. The pre-dynastic Egyptians of Upper Egypt were engaged in vigorous trade with Nubia and Ethiopia since around 4800 BC. Ancient Egypt was also known as Kemet, which means black land. The creation of ancient Egypt can be credited to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom by the African king Narmer. The wife of Narmer was the African queen named Neithhotep, which means is satisfied. Both Upper and Lower Egypt had insignias which represented the two regions of Egypt. Lower Egypt was represented by the Egyptian cobra, and Upper Egypt was represented by the Egyptian vulture. The double crown, which represents the unification of both of these regions, is known as the Shent. The ancient African artifact called the Narmer palette is a piece of soft, dark gray siltstone and has carved into it a depiction of King Narmer dating back to 3100 BC. The Narmer palette depicts King Narmer wearing the double crown of unification. King Narmer, also known as Menes, is well known as the first official king of unified Egypt. After the unification of Egypt into one powerful kingdom was concluded, the first dynasty of Egypt was established by King Narmer, and from that time onwards, the kings of Egypt became known as pharaohs. Ancient Egypt was divided into a series of dynasties from the first dynasty in 3100 BC to 31st dynasty in 332 AD. Historians have grouped each Egyptian dynasties into a series of kingdoms and periods, namely the early dynastic period, the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, the second intermediate period, the New Kingdom, the third intermediate period, the late period, the Macedonian period, and the Ptolemaic period. The early dynastic period is characterized as the period of time from the inception of ancient Egypt by Pharaoh Narmer in 3100 BC until the beginning of the Old Kingdom in 2686 BC and the rise of Pharaoh Djoser, who established the third dynasty of Egypt. The Old Kingdom is characterized as the period of time from 2686 BC until the rise of Pharaoh Menkaure in 2181 BC. In the first 919 years of Egypt, we find the implementation of a royal family, government, administration, ministers, treasury, and judiciary. The Egyptian writing system known as hieroglyphics had started by 3500 BC and was used throughout the entire history of Egypt. The first pyramids were designed and constructed during this period as well. From the time the Egyptians established their government and administration, they began to impose taxation on the populace. Taxes could be paid with goods when required, and they were collected by administrators of the respective divisions known as a nome. In Egypt, a nome was the name for an administrative division of Egypt. Egypt was divided into a total of 42 administrative divisions, with 20 in Lower Egypt and 22 in Upper Egypt. All tax revenue from each division was managed by the royal vizier. The royal vizier was the highest position in Egypt underneath the pharaoh. The Egyptians engaged in a lot of mining in within their territory. The ancient Egyptians benefited from the rich mineral deposits available in this region of Africa. Both the Egyptians and the Nubian Empire to the south engaged in mining across their respective kingdoms. The Egyptians mined for copper and gold, which was fashioned and traded. The Egyptian copper mines were located in their eastern desert. To the south in the area called Aswan Quartzite, tin and lead were mined. Also, limestone and alabaster were mined and then crafted into artifacts. In the north of Egypt, there were located quarries for quartzite, alabaster, and natron. From all the sources, jewelry, amulets, crowns, and other artifacts were used to decorate the temples, palaces, and homes of the Egyptians. The Africans of Egypt were extremely advanced in architecture and construction, and over a 1,000-year period focused on developing a series of pyramids across their empire. The first pyramid designed and constructed by the Egyptians was the Pyramid of Djoser, which is also known as the Step Pyramid. The Pyramid of Djoser was located north of the city of Memphis and was built by Pharaoh Djoser in 2650 BC. The largest of the pyramids was the Pyramid of Khufu, also known as the Pyramid of Giza, which was developed from 2.3 million limestone blocks which weighed 3 tons each. The pyramid stands at 146 meters in height and is 230 meters in width. The Egyptians eventually constructed over 100 pyramids in Egypt, and there was a requirement to organize thousands of laborers who were overseen by the overseer of all the king's works. The overseer of all the king's works was the name of the position given to the man who was responsible for the design, position, and construction of the pyramid. One of the earliest pyramid architects was an Egyptian scientist and engineer named Imhotep, who is credited with the development of the Pyramid of Djoser. Imhotep is considered a genius and polymath, who also held the title of Director of Public Works in Upper and Lower Egypt and Recorder of the Annals. Pyramids typically were located to the west of the Nile River. As the sun also sets in the west, this was considered the resting place of the dead. As we mentioned before, the Nubian Empire was located just south of Egypt and was established in 4800 BC. Nubia, like Egypt, was originally divided into Upper Nubia, southern, and Lower Nubia, northern. The early Nubians engaged in trade with the early pre-dynastic Egyptians who were known as the Naqada. After the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the establishment of ancient Egypt, trade continued. The Egyptians referred to Nubia as the land of the bow due to their expertise in warfare using the bow and arrow. Nubia was also known as Taseti. The relationship between the two empires was usually peaceful, and they engaged in the trade of copper, ostrich feathers, pottery, exotic animals, fruits, wood, and gold. The Nubians had greater access to goods from Central Africa, and the Egyptians had greater access to the markets of the Mediterranean and Europe due to their respective geographical locations. This was only the beginning, and the mighty Africans of Egypt would continue to develop their civilization over the coming centuries.